Welcome to American Dreams. My guest today is Thomasina Williams. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. Thank you for having me.
So we met at the Legacy Builder Conference in Florida, and appreciate you joining us for that. Let's chat a little bit about what you're working on right now, and how you got started on that. So, what is family system leadership, and what pulled you toward that path instead of something more traditional like finance or law?
Well, interesting question. Actually, law was my first career. I'm actually on my third career now. Family systems leadership is a different way to look at your family and your role within your family. Oftentimes, we have been kind of socialized to think about what is going on as individual behavior only. In families, people get labels. So and so is the so called problem child, or someone is the responsible person. And what family systems leadership says is that families are actually interconnected. None of us act in a vacuum. Families are constantly reacting to and interacting with each other, which makes them a system. And as a system, we discern patterns over time. Real prominent topic these days with the advent of AI in our lives. Looking for patterns within your family can help people to understand that what is going on is not the quote fault or attributed to any one individual because people are reacting to each other. And frankly, when tensions rise within families, as they inevitably do, from exciting things like a wedding or the arrival of a new baby in the family to issues like a liquidity event or maybe sibling rivalry, trying to figure out generational transitions. All those kinds of issues cause tensions to rise within families. And the real key is to understand that no one person rather is a quote problem here, but they're all interacting, and to identify the patterns of those interactions so that you can then interrupt the ones that are not serving the family. And because it's a system, it means that any one person can make a difference in how the entire family functions by virtue of changing how they choose to engage. And that is what family systems leadership is.
How has your own story shaped the way you work with families today?
I was led to this work, I believe, by divine intervention. So I grew up in the Central Florida area. My maternal grandparents were citrus growers and owned significant land in Central Florida in an area not too far from Disney World. They very hardworking people, people of very strong faith. My grandparents had no formal education, but somehow they had this innate business sense and worked together really well and accomplished quite a bit. As a matter of fact, the community I grew up in named the neighborhood that I lived in after my grandparents. That's how, without our family really even asking. My grandparents also, though, did not believe in a lot of legal formalities. I recall as a child talking with my grandfather about the need for he and my grandmother to create a will. My grandmother had had a stroke, and it was clear to me as a high schooler that there were going to be some challenges once my grandparents were no longer around. My grandfather said, "Don't you worry about a thing," kind of patted me on my head and said, "You just focus on your schooling. Your uncle so and so, who was the oldest male, knew what to do and was going to take care of everything." Well, as things unfolded, it did not work out quite the way that my grandfather thought it would. And with 8 children, unfortunately, they weren't able to work through their differences. What my grandparents were not counting on is the fact that oftentimes when there are tensions between siblings, they won't do certain things around their parents. They keep a lid on it, so to speak. But when the parents are no longer around, those tensions can come to surface, particularly when significant financial assets are involved. And unfortunately, my mom's generation, frankly, lost all of that significant wealth that my grandparents had worked so hard to build. And I believe I was led to this work. I didn't know, frankly, that the work existed. I just kind of stumbled on it after a career as an attorney in Miami and then working in philanthropy in New York. And so I feel like this is definitely destiny for me to figure out how to course correct for my own family, as well as be a resource for other families. The research shows that the reasons families have challenges and tend to put the assets rather at risk in ways that people don't recognize are really internal to the family itself and the family's inability to communicate well, to work through differences and tensions, and that over time trust erodes. And that is the source of the problem. So, my own family is a lived experience of what is often referred to as the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in three generations proverb. And I'm just privileged to have found this work, again, to course correct for my own family, as well as to be a resource for other families in working through those difficult moments.
Hey, you talked a lot about human capital and what does that actually mean inside of a family?
That means the relationships. That means people's ability to tap into their innate resources. While it's important that families rely upon professionals for a host of issues, and the more significant your financial assets are, frankly, the more you need that kind of professional support. I believe, though, that families have within them the ability to work through whatever issues they may be addressing. We tend to think about financial capital as the only capital, but if you reflect on it, there would be no financial capital but for someone having made an investment in the human capital. It all starts with people. And yet, the wealthier people become, oftentimes, the less they focus on continuing to develop that capacity. Because as the family grows, as the assets grow, as different generations come on board, the complexity actually increases as well. And the human capital is necessary to navigate that kind of complexity.
Why do you think relationships are both the family's greatest asset and sometimes its biggest risk?
Precisely for that very reason, that the relationship of family members themselves, at least one person at some point, whether you're first generation wealth or 12th generation wealth, it all started with one person at least. Maybe there are a couple of people who started a business. These days, people will generate significant income through startups, through being members of some organization perhaps that is acquired, so that stock options and that kind of thing come into play today in a way that they didn't before. But it all starts with at least one person taking a risk and making an investment that leads to this significant wealth. The challenge becomes, how do we hold on to that wealth as the family grows in numbers, as their assets grow in complexity, and as we're adding different generations who bring a different perspective, a different set of priorities? All of those combined lead to the complexity that make the human capital, the people side of the equation, a risk, candidly, that most people tend to overlook. We focus so much on the financial assets that we oftentimes take for granted that the people who are the owners and beneficiaries of those assets are going to follow all of the nice, neat procedures and the legal structures that are set up. But we know that that's just not reality.
So, where do you see communication breakdown most often in families?
A host of issues. I think the biggest challenge with communication is it tends to be kind of a fallback. Whenever there's a challenge within a family, people often say, oh, they just need to learn to communicate better. The challenge, though, is the skills that we're often taught to help us communicate better. Things like maintaining eye contact, like reflecting back what you heard. Those kinds of techniques really require thought. It requires executive processing, which is in the front part of our brain. That's the prefrontal cortex. When tensions rise, when people get a little anxious, when people are nervous, when people are upset, we cannot access that part of our brain. The more primitive part of our brain, and near closer to the stem, takes over automatically, instinctively. And so when people say communication, it's interesting to me that the communication skills that we need the most are the ones that we're least able to access when we need them. It requires a deeper understanding of what is going on within families. I refer to communication challenges as being just the tip of the iceberg. And the need is to dive deeper to understand what's happening within that larger family system, the context within which people are experiencing these communication challenges. That's the level at which you begin to think about and notice the patterns. And understanding the patterns is what can help you to navigate the situation better so that then you can maintain the ability to remember all of those great communication skills.
When we look at sibling rivalry, what tends to be the root of conflict in those relationships?
Well, it's interesting. Civil sibling rivalry are often seen as conflicts, and we tend again to think about the world as evolving, even with families, based on individual relationships. So that gets translated as, oh, these two people just have a personality conflict, a personality clash where they maybe just don't like each other or are vying for their parents' attention, when sibling rivalry is actually one of those patterns. Conflict is one of the four patterns that emerge when there's tension within a family. So, what is happening is there is tension someplace in that family that simply happens to be emerging most visible in this relationship between these two people. What I find in my work with families is often sibling rivalry has a lot to do with the parents and how the parents are dealing with their children. In some cases, because our society candidly tends to be very materialistic, people equate getting access to certain resources within a family as how much the parents may love them. Now, that's not what parents are intending. That's not what parents are thinking. But because we're not verbalizing and talking about these issues, people tend to make up their own story around. For example, I have a client right now, two daughters. One daughter got married quite a number of years ago in a relatively small community. So the wedding budget wasn't that huge. The younger daughter, now getting married, several years between them, is getting married black tie in Manhattan, in New York City. That's a very different budget. And so understanding those differences and the family being able to talk about why the parents are doing what they're doing, to let the daughters know that the amount that is spent on a wedding is not an indication of the parents' love and affection for each of their children. We don't tend to have those kinds of conversations because they can make people uncomfortable. And when we are uncomfortable, we shy away. Again, there are four distinct patterns. One of them is distance. And simply not talking about something is the way that many people choose to deal with it. It just sends the issue underground. It doesn't eliminate it in totality.
Is there a way that individuals can disagree without breaking relationships in families?
Absolutely. I believe that there is a way to say anything that needs to be said The biggest challenge quite often is mustering the courage to figure out how to do that, to have the patience to be clear about what it is that the person wants to communicate. Think about how they want to communicate it. Think about the timing, even of that communication and the circumstances. There may be some things that need to happen before the person shares whatever the particular topic is that they want to talk about. This is where the family systems leadership comes in, and being able to sit with your own discomfort long enough to think through what is the way to share what I want to share in a way that it can be heard, as opposed to simply blurting it out on instinct, snapping back at someone, and then regretting what has been said. It requires a certain amount of patience.
When we look at preparing for the next generation, um, how early should families start having those conversations around stewardship and responsibility?
They should start when your children are toddlers. One of the things that often tends to happen in financially successful families, I have clients who have waited until the child are in their 20s or perhaps even older, and it's time for a trust distribution. By that time, all of their values, their beliefs, their personal orientation to money have been fully formed. And one of the things about children, and I think increasingly these days, children are very smart. They are constantly watching what the adults around them actually do. Not what the adults say, but what the adults do. And so teaching young people about responsibility around money, teaching them values, what is and isn't important to the family, why it is and isn't important. How did the family come to have the resources that they're blessed to have today? What does it take to manage those resources today, but also ensure that the resources are preserved for their children's children? That is a process that I believe should be integrated to the extent possible into parenting as early as possible.
So, how should families approach succession when emotions and expectations are involved, and how is that different from leading a business?
Emotions and expectations are always involved, regardless of what is going on, because again, the family is a system because of those relationships and those interconnections that are just innate to family. There are always going to be emotions. There are always going to be expectations. The challenge is to actually manage those on questions of succession. Sometimes I've had clients where the father created a very successful business that made the family incredibly wealthy. And in two cases I'm thinking about, in one case, a young man was the oldest. Another case, it was a young woman who was the oldest. And they grew up in that business and had assumed that they would one day leave the business. In both cases, the father decided he had a huge opportunity, significant liquidity event, which led to everyone in the family becoming infinitely more wisdom than the dad had ever dreamed. So he saw that as an opportunity to bless his family for generations and sold the business. In the case of the young man, he was devastated. He was so hurt, he did not talk to his father for over a year. He felt as though he had been groomed his entire life to lead this business. And then when dad sold the business, even though it made the son independently wealthy and he could go out and start any business he wanted or acquire other businesses, it was like a dagger to his heart, and it took him quite a while to get over that because in our society, we tend to get our identities wrapped up in our financial assets. It took that young man quite a while to get over that. In the other case, the young woman, frankly, is not that young anymore. She would be considered middle-aged, and when she talks about not being able to lead the family business, Even today, decades later, it brings tears to her eyes because she felt like it had destabilized her entire world. Again, independently wealthy now, but her entire orientation had been towards that business that no longer exists. And so those are the kinds of conversations families need to have and need to be aware of. It's not just about the money. And in many cases, the money is not the most important part. I believe that the most precious asset that any family has is who they are individually and collectively as a family, not what they own. And those two actual case studies, I think, are a great example of that.
Okay, one final question here. When we talk about habits, what are some of the habits that siblings can adopt to stay close, both with each other and their parents?
Well, that's a great question. And this is interesting because families are so different. And individuals within families are very different. So I would say the most important person for a young person, a sibling looking to stay close, is to figure out first and foremost what is important to me. Where do I stand? What do I want to do? And how is it that I want to be close to my family? Example, my family goes on family vacations at times. I'm close to my family, but I don't always want to go on vacation with them or to the places that they want to go. Sometimes we can say, oh, I want to be close to my family, therefore I'm going to do this and be miserable while you're there. That's not helpful to anyone else enjoying it or to you. So, to be able to know what's important to you and to say to my family, I love you, but I think I'll sit this one out. I would love for you to send photographs of the great time that you're having, to be able to say what you truly think and feel and to do that with love and respect, I think is the best way to develop strong relationships with siblings as well as with parents, not to hold things in. If I have a question or concern about something, to come to the family member directly with whom I have that question or concern rather than talking to someone else about it. That's one of the three patterns. It's called triangles. Rather than talking about a conflict with my brother, I run and talk to my mom about it. That may spread out my anxiety and make me feel better momentarily, but it's not going to resolve the conflict between me and my brother. And for mom to get involved is not helpful because then my brother and I never develop the capacity ourselves to work through our differences. Another challenge is that financially successful families have. If they haven't figured out how to work through their differences while their parents are around, it's not likely you're going to do that when the parents are not around and there are significant financial assets, different priorities, different thoughts about what the family should do in the direction in which it should go.
Well, Thomasina, it's been a pleasure having you with us here on American Dreams. If someone wants to reach out for more information or to contact you, how would they do that?
They would probably, the best way to do that is simply to reach out through my website, which is developfamilyleaders.com. Developfamilyleaders.com, which is a clear statement that I could find of the nature of the work that I do with families.
Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Alan.